Good evening, everyone. I'm Kari Reagan, and welcome to the final NATS chat of this season. I've been looking forward to this chat with my dear colleagues all year, and we have with us tonight Mike Ruckles, Trinice Robinson-Martin, and Melissa Cross. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's jump in by just having you share a little bit about your background, what brought you. I know Mike Ruckles teaches in New York. He conducts Broadway shows. Share a little bit, Mike, about what brought you to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I started off in vocal performance in college, and I think like a lot of vocal performance majors, I went into it thinking I was going to learn how to sing everything. And of course, surprise, surprise, I learned how to sing classically, which was, now retrospectively, I would not have missed for the world. It really informed my teaching and gave me a wonderful foundation. But I came out of my undergraduate really thinking how to make these sounds that I grew up listening to cast recordings, and Broadway was in my heart, and I really wanted to know how to make these sounds. And so I began kind of a long journey at that point. But moved to New York in 2010 and have been teaching here in the studio since then. Before that, I was teaching at the University of Northern Colorado, and that's sort of my background.
Thank you. I love that. Thank you. I know, in a nutshell. And I'll refer you all to Mike Ruckles' new website that he's just launched that's fabulous. And you, of course, can read in more detail the nitty-gritty of the bio, which is very interesting. So please go to mikeruckles.com. Isn't that what it is, Mike?
That's right.
Yeah.
Simple.
Simple. Perfect. So Trinice, how about you? Share with us a little bit about what brought you to Princeton, which is where you teach now.
Yeah, so my background is more jazz. My undergrad is in jazz and my master's is in jazz. And then when I graduated, I although my background is in jazz, my teachers were always classical up until that point. But I still studied jazz as well. One of the things that I realized is coming out of the Black church, I'm a PK, which is a preacher's kid. My father's a pastor and his father's a pastor and so on. So one of the things, singing was just a part of like what we do. That's just a cultural experience. So I never really thought about gospel singing as a thing to study. But what I did realize is that with all the education that I have and all the student loans to go with that education, I still felt inadequate to sing my own culture's music. I felt overtrained. I felt, or not necessarily overtrained, but I felt like my training did not match the needs that I wanted to express. I felt like I was too calculated and a lot of those things. And that actually brought me to my doctorate research, which was about, okay, well, what does soul singing mean? What does it mean from a pedagogic standpoint? What does it mean from a scientific standpoint? So that's why a lot of the work that you might see of mine is very science-based, because I needed those answers for me. I needed to know, well, what is it that makes soul singing sound and feel and experience the way it does, and how do you articulate that in an academic setting so that one does not have to feel like, in order to sing correct, or in order to be vocally responsible, or in order to be academic, you have to kind of maintain these classical European standards and diminish the value and the practice of the oral tradition. So instead, my work has basically been dedicated to trying to articulate for the academic community and translate for the academic community, what do these sounds mean, and how does the learning culture establish even within those African American folk-based music styles, which are jazz, gospel, and I mean jazz from the Black perspective, because there's two sides of jazz also. Gospel, R&B, hip hop, blues, folk. What does that mean? And that's really what motivates me to do the things that I do. So
we need more of you. I love that. Thank you. And we need more of you in academics, right? We just have to have all voices being heard. as we move forward into the 21st century. So I'm so grateful for that. I'm curious, and we maybe should save this for later, but it's fresh in my mind. You just mentioned there are two sides to jazz.
Hmm.
Can you augment that thought for us a little
Yeah.
bit?
Well, when you think about jazz or the history of African American music or music American music in general, before the 1930s, I mean, 1940s, it was hillbilly music and race records. So therefore, every aspect of American music will have a white side and a black side, if you will. That's for the non-political, the politically incorrect version of saying it. But so as a result, the blues side of jazz, or the side that really grabs on to all of the influence that comes out of the Black community, is found in jazz from that standpoint. Whereas from the hillbilly white side, if you will, to use that same terminology that was historically used, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have another perspective that's going to be more in the vaudeville. It's going to be more of a pop sound. It's going to have all of these components that are not as valued on the race record side,
Mm-hmm.
until we get into this blending in the 50s and then the 60s, and then you start to break things down. You have the cold jazz versus the soul jazz or the hard bop, and all of these different aspects that people that are outside of the genre or even the culture may not even recognize. They'll just know that, oh, I like this. Horace Silver just sounds different from Chet Baker.
Mm-hmm.
So those are those little subtleties that I think were not accentuated in my own learning and my own upbringing. So when I actually came up as a jazz singer, I was feeling a little bit like I was not good enough, because what I would hear is like, you can hear the gospel in my jazz. And I thought that was an insult.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
and because I'm not sounding like all of those parameters that people will have, like, oh, well, jazz has this, it has no vibrato. Well, I actually have a lot of vibrato. So does Sarah Vaughan. So does Dinah Washington, who all come out of the Black church. So all of these things. So it's because I have vibrato, does it mean that I'm less jazzy? Or, it's all of these different, don't get me started.
Okay. We'll definitely, I'm going to add that to the list right now, Trinice, and we will come back round.
Don't get me started.
If they only knew about our pre-chat, didn't we have fun on our pre-chat?
Yes.
And dear friend Melissa Cross, hi. Thank you for being here. And of course, Melissa's well known to our NATS members, but share a little bit for people that don't know your background that's brought you to be the Melissa Cross Queen of Zen of Scream in New York.
Okay, so I started as a child with a hairbrush in the mirror, lip syncing to Janis Joplin, and I went to Interlochen. It's a high school for the arts in Michigan, to study voice, because my parents, my father was British, and so you have to do things properly. And if you want to be a singer, you have to learn to do it properly. So I did my art songs and all that at Interlochen. I was a piano student, but I got into the theater and I started playing guitar there with my friends. And I ended up in the Old Vic Theatre School in England. And what happened was, at the end of my theater training, about 4 years in England, I did a song that a guy from New York was workshopping a Broadway production, and I was singing and his song, and I went, "It's wonderful to feel like this." He goes, "No, don't sing it like that. Don't put all that stuff in it. Just sing the song." And I was like, I am singing the song, because by that time, singing was defined in a very specific way at Interlochen, right? So I didn't understand when he said, just sing the song, because every time I tried to sing the song, it sounded like art songs. So he got me to imitate a Karen Carpenter record, and I felt like a dead person, like, just like me. I felt like I was dead, like it was all air and no energy, and I thought that I was going to make a real fool of myself at the end of year production, and I got a standing ovation. So I thought, okay, this is weird. All right, so I decided to put the theater away, and I became a rock singer. and it was the punk thing, and I was in punk bands, and I was still taking classical music, and none of the sounds that I was learning in classical voice lessons I could use at CBGB. So I basically got injured, and I went to speech therapy at the referral of a doctor, and that speech therapist was Joan Lader. And Joan Lader introduced me to a proprioceptive kind of sensation that felt like head resonance, but it was used in the context of speaking. And I thought, oh, I get it. It started the ball rolling. Mm-hmm. So basically, someone asked me to teach them, and I just needed some money, and I started teaching. I said, boy, I know a lot about this. So all of a sudden I was a teacher, and I loved it. I loved teaching, loved it. So I became a teacher in 1990. I was still in rock bands until 2000, but ultimately I just loved teaching so much that I just didn't really, I had a child, and I just loved teaching. It gave me everything that what happened is that during when I was teaching, this producer in Connecticut asked me to do him a favor. He couldn't get these screaming kids through a recording session without coughing blood. And so I said, well, I'll give it a shot. And he brought the student in, and it was like, oh my God, this is like, it was like, rah, like real screaming. And I said, okay, I'll try, because I had seen this kind of solidarity going on with these kids. They had the same clothes, and they were all doing this moshing, and they were all committed, and they had this thing like the 60s. It was very 60s feeling. It was how I got into the hairbrush in the mirror thing. It was that 1968 Summer of Love, and it was, them, the other generation, the old guys, and the new generation. It was the counterculture, and there was something like that I wanted to be a part of, because it was very real and very sincere. So I figured out how to make those noises in a healthful way. And I went in and got it scoped. And at that time, I started reading Bernard. Like it was my Bible. Bernard was my Bible. And I put together a instructional DVD, because I couldn't teach all those screaming people, because it got really popular, this screaming thing. And I did it as a service. It became very successful. And one teacher said, I listened to this Zen of Screaming thing, and I was all prepared to say it was rubbish, but you really, it's pretty good. Why don't you come to the Voice Foundation? And that was it. So I came to the Voice Foundation in 2005. I've been there every year since, and NATS and NISTA. And I became like a geek, and I love being a geek. And that's my story.
I love it. And I'm so grateful for our tribe. We just, every time we all get together and be voice geeks, it's such a great gift for me. Well, let's talk about the broad spectrum, the significance of the broad spectrum. And the reason I came up with this chat actually was a year ago. Melissa and I in my home having a glass of wine after a Northwest Voice Conference. And she was frustrated about an aspect of chest singing and what is deemed belting. And what I led the conversation to kind of a resolution of what you're talking about is the broad spectrum of those sounds. But I think that when CCM, the term CCM, contemporary commercial music, came around, I think especially for classical singers, we suddenly had language a little bit, a label, and a sense of, oh, belting, and now we're learning that belting is healthy, and so that was to us, CCM meant belting. Now we're full circle. There is a broad spectrum of sounds in CCM that require different vocal productions, right? So that's what we're here to talk about, and to really, I think I want to get word out that just says, listen, CCM is not belting. It is a part of it, but it's much more than that. And Trinice has already discussed within the jazz genre that there are different styles, qualities of sound. Yeah. So, Mike, let's bring it back to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what I've just talked about, this broad spectrum of CCM, and what does that bring up for you?
Well, I think it's made a lot of sense to me that we have been so belt-centric in the world of formal voice training, and particularly in NATS, because I think when we explore something new, when we open the doors to a new exploration, we have ushered in this world of CCM into our formal voice training, it only makes sense that we would begin by exploring that which feels the most polarizing, that which feels the most opposite to what we know. And I think now what you're saying, Kari, is that we've arrived at a place where we want to expand our horizons. We want to explore more and talk about the other, sounds in this world, of which, as you say, belting is just one of many, many sounds. I mean, I think what I enjoy so much about, I would say about 80% of my studio is comprised of Broadway music theater folk. And what I love so much about working with music theater folk is that the world of music theater encompasses really all of the styles of, especially these days, encompasses all of the styles of CCM. I mean, somebody brought in a gospel song today from Memphis. Somebody, will bring in a kind of screamy rock song from School of Rock. So many different worlds in which we get to thrive. So it's never, ever boring. And there are so many sounds that we have to figure out how to make sustainably. And belting, is just a small, small piece of that pie. And I think you're right. Now that we've been exploring it for so long and really hashing it out in conferences and workshops and NATS chats, we've arrived at a place where I think we want a bit more holistic view.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect. And Trinice, for you, how would you say in general, when you're working with somebody in a CCM fashion, that might be different from Mike working with somebody who's getting ready to go on as Thoroughly Modern Millie? So in some part of the,
Well, one of the things that I think in what I do that creates another dimension is that the singers that I'm working with, I want them to be genuine. I want them to tell their own story. They have no characters to hide behind. So when I say cry like you cry, I need you to cry like you cry, not cry like you think you're supposed to cry like in order to be effective. So the approach to a lot of the pedagogy that I'm dealing with is how am I going to nurture your voice? How am I going to value and validate your voice and your emotive process so that I can nurture your ability to communicate that, within your song, within the context that you're singing, and value all the dimensions that come into that, and not try to force you to maintain parameters that I think makes you sound A, B, or C, or D, because all of the styles that I'm teaching is about your own personal identity showing through, and what that means to you is going to make you as a singer be separate from this other person who has the same voice type, body shape, and whatnot. You have different stories. So my job is to make sure that I bring your story out of your natural voice with your genuine expression in the manner that fits stylistically in the dialogue that you're singing, in the musical dialogue that you're singing.
that was such a brilliant answer, Trinice. Thank you. I mean, it was an unexpected answer, and I always love that because we always get in our little lane. So I appreciate that you brought it back to telling a story. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts in a minute here. I have to say, I love that it's been 20 minutes and we haven't mentioned the registration word yet. So that's
up. Time's up.
I know. That was my segue to you, my friend. So, Melissa, since this conversation started with you and me and a glass of wine, what's your perspective about all this?
Well, the thing is that it's apples and oranges, indeed. It is, one has a microphone and the other one has the task of projecting without a microphone. So that in itself is a huge difference. Classical music is linear, it's not rhythmic. Contemporary non-classical music, or CCM, has a rhythm about which we phrase against a pulse. It has a tribal kind of affect, and its focus is authenticity, like Trinice said. It's not about beauty necessarily. So therefore, there's a lot more registrations allowed in CCM. I mean, you don't hear a song all in the same texture. you hear a light registration, maybe in a verse, and then you hear a heavy registration in a chorus, back to a lighter registration. There's all these different sounds. However, a voice is a voice is a voice. And the same challenges that a classical singer has to communicate a song in that style exists for CCM singers as well. In other words, that main nemesis being the ability to move from a lower part of the range to the upper part of the range without a bunch of speed bumps. I mean, that is that when I talk about registration, I'm not talking about head, chest, mix. I'm talking about the dynamic aspect of navigating that challenge.
Mhm.
And teaching that to someone who is in the business of authenticity, it gets tricky when you start putting labels like head, chest, and mix. This is where it gets really tricky because the mind can't do more than one thing at once. And if you're in the song, it's kind of a distraction to think, oh, I'm going to do this in head and this in mix, because then you're not in the song. You're not, and people can feel that. Where it's a whole, like I said, it's apples and oranges, but we're dealing with the same car.
But there's a
So
time, but there is a time. I mean, I always use Tiger Woods in golfing for some reason. Tiger Woods still does have to go to the driving range every day, right? And work from
Right.
the driving range before he walks out and plays 18 holes at the Masters. So,
absolutely,
so there is
absolutely.
that aspect of
Yeah,
this conversation.
but in order for those skills to become generalized, they need to be absorbed in a proprioceptive way. And this is my journey. You see, like what happens is that you can intellectually understand what a mix is or what head is, and you can learn it with a label. But to be able to actually experience it in the body at the same time, like it's very important to feel it in the way that as it's dynamically moving, not
Mhm.
as a thing or a static instance. So it's important to know about these things and it's important to practice them, but the way that you understand them needs to have like a dynamism or a dynamic thing that actually, and that's where the science-based imagery comes from. I mean, obviously imagery is not useful if it's not based on something that is really actually going on, but it needs to be a thought cue, like a swing shot. Like I'm sure Tiger Woods has like a swing thought. Like there's some thought that probably has nothing to do with golf, it has to do with some abstract visual thing that helps him get the hole in one. And it's based on science, it's based on the precepts of science, but it's not the actual science in performance. It's some other language.
Okay.
And I think that the skills stick when it's transmitted in that way. That's just my opinion.
I love it. Mike, jump in here. I see you.
Yeah, I'm just amening over here. That was fantastic, Melissa. I completely agree. And I go so far, we talked about this in our pre-chat. I talk as little, in me personally, I talk as little about head voice, chest voice, mixing them together as possible, because I think that words are important and I want to make sure that what I'm communicating is tied to some sort of a physical reality. In fact, I think it was, someone brilliant on I don't know how many of you are on the new forum for professional voice teachers on Facebook, said that he would prefer, it was Kenneth Bozeman.
I was going to say, I probably can't.
Yep, he said that he prefers fact-based to fact-laced, and I loved that expression. I have taken it for my own. But rather than talk about vocal gears, which have very little physiological reality, but unfortunately have a lot of psychological reality, I prefer to talk about psychological gears: to speak, to sing, to call, to cry, to whine, to yell. We could identify, an infinite amount of these cues. And just like Melissa was saying, these are cues that actually have meaning to our body. They instruct us, and there's no middleman there. And especially because I work predominantly with actors, this has been, really kind of a game changer for me. But then I find surprisingly that my opera singers, my rock singers, they want to talk that way too. They don't want to talk about, on this note, I'm aiming for 60% chest and 40% head, because that is a very vague, abstract concept. Now, that being said, I have some wonderful colleagues who teach exactly that way, and they produce great results. So there are many paths to Rome.
I love thank you for saying that, because I am somebody who does choose to use the language for a variety of reasons. Yeah, for a variety of reasons that aren't relevant to this conversation. Since,
of course.
But so I appreciate you saying that. So if you have someone who you're wanting a legit head musical theater sound, what word might you come up with?
Well, that's when things get interesting, because one of the verbs that I do use in the studio is to sing, and sometimes there is a time to sing. And our goal then is, as Melissa was talking about, we're not so interested in CCM generally with beautifully consistent timbre, as is our goal with bel canto. Our goal is throughout the range on every vowel, can we have beautifully consistent timbre? In CCM, that's very rarely our goal, but when we sing something that is hearkening towards classical, as is music theater legit, then we're going to bring all of that to bear, certainly. And yeah, that's a hard question, actually, because it would be sort of very contextual how we would work through that.
Well, yeah. And I've heard more and more people talk about primal sounds, or just, whatever, or people use farm animals, right? The sheep, what's that called? The farm, oh, I'm forgetting, but it's very but anyway, and I think, everyone many roads lead to Rome. And by the way, I have to just say, Dan Mitten, one of the moderators of the new forum for professional voice teachers, was very excited. Shout out to them. And Arliss Alfred completely agrees with Melissa and Mike as they were sharing. And we welcome other questions. Please, there's a little question box, or raise your little virtual hand, and I will ask our panelists. But Trinise, let's let you jump in here before we move away from, registration conversation, possibly.
Well, I mean, I'm a somatic voice work Levetri person. So there's a part of me that's going to have a very functional kind of way of teaching, even though I'm going to have a style conditioning part. So, and that's the style conditioning thing is what, when I teach, my pedagogy is the training of the instrument and then the conditioning of the style. So when I'm training the instrument, I do want you to know what chest voice and head voice and all of the things in between. I do want you to recognize what you are doing, how you are doing it, and when you are doing it. However, when I'm moving into a style conditioning where I'm really trying to make your voice do something for a style or stylistic purposes, that is when I'm going to bring some of those, well, you know how it is when you're crying. What does that feel like? Or you're trying to now, you're trying to bridge that gap between, this is the functional part of my voice doing this, and this is what my voice does in this style as I'm developing it to try to achieve these particular characteristics. So yes, I sit in between you, Carrie, and Mike and Melissa, depending on where I am in the teaching process. Because, and I'm a big stickler for people knowing what their instrument is, because in gospel particularly, there's a lot of instances where you don't have amplification if you're in the choir. So I need you to feel what you can't hear, because oftentimes you're thinking you can't hear yourself, because at choir rehearsal there's no monitors for choirs, unless you're at a really big professional situation, and most people are not. So I need you to know what's supposed to be happening in your body. I need you to be able to feel when you're doing too much. And I need you to be able, as my student, come back and tell me what happened. I want to educate you as a student to make sure that you know what things should feel like, what things shouldn't feel like, and the areas that there is something that is happening, if you're feeling a particular discomfort, or if something is happening within the tone. I want you to have the information that you need to make educative or informative choices about what to do or what not to do next, or how to get through this particular performance or engagement. So, you know, I definitely ride that fence between I need you to know your instrument, and then I don't want you to think about, as you're saying, as you're worshiping particularly, I don't want you to think about, oh, am I going into head voice? For me, because again, I'm more on the authentic person or the authentic self, that I'm usually making my singers be very attentive to how they communicate in life, and I try to bridge those particular gaps in essence to kind of remind them that when we're high in pitch, like when we are in a belt in real life, particularly if you're an animated self like me, you
Mm-hmm.
know, your body is engaged. You are happy. You are not sitting down like this and going, oh my gosh, this is great. Like we don't do that. Yet when we go to choir rehearsal after a long day, that's exactly what happens. And so of course, if your body is not supported, but if we're excited and we're telling somebody something, our body is engaged. We don't have to think about, okay, let me support because I'm excited now. So a lot of the things that I'm doing is trying to condition and make sure that students are aware that there are certain things that they can do, that they do naturally already if they just allow themselves. We flip all the time. I know I flip. What? Are you kidding me? You know, I don't have to sit there and go, okay, that's a head lick that is, you know, because I need to get that note.
Right.
But the more that I condition the instrument of the student and then say, so now when we put your personality to that, then your body, your instrument will be conditioned to sustain your emotive self on a longer continuum, which is what happens when we're singing. You know, we're just exaggerated speech. It's just exaggerated emotion. And now, because I've had these physical or very intentful functional training and development, my instrument is strong enough to withstand this conversation, this musical conversation that I'm going to have.
Yes, and you know, I want to add to that. I love that because before I, as a teacher, before I overlay a random technique on you or something arbitrary and technical and put together a recipe for your instrument or whatever it may be, I want to look at what does your body already know how to do organically,
Yes.
intuitively. So when you talk higher in your range, if we're looking at mixing, if you're talking higher in your range, you know how to do that. You do that
Right.
all the time. So how do you
Right.
do that without getting louder? What is your body giving you?
Right.
And we want to look at those cues first. And then actually we do in lessons often get very technical about what are you feeling? Are you tuned into the levator muscles in the soft palate? What's going on there? Where do you feel pressure building up? Do you feel that in the inner ear and the eustachian tube? We're really taking mental snapshots of each of those perceptions that we're having internally. And I think if we can first, especially I think for music theater where we're acting based first, if we can look at what does your body know how to do first before we take it somewhere that's rather unknown.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess, oh, go ahead, Melissa.
I was just thinking, I think what we're talking about is, you know, I titled my DVD instructional thing, The Zen of Screaming, and I'm not a Buddhist. I'm talking about Zen as here and now. And what I found, it's very interesting, when I am teaching a very difficult thing, it's vocal fry, but it's not standard like, it's like, that's vocal fry. It's a different position of the lips and tongue and everything else. But what happens is that when students are learning this and they are going for a sound that they've already heard, they lose the pressure they need to keep up the sound. So what I have realized all the time, this is never fails, as soon as they listen to their voice to see how they're doing, if they are doing the imitated sound that they are getting, the whole thing collapses because the breath pressure goes away. So this is like an experiment that happened by accident for me. And so what we're talking about is that you guys are right on the money. You're talking about like you do these things in speaking, but it's not sing as you speak, because if your speaking voice doesn't sound good, then it's not going to sound good if you sing that way. So
Exactly.
it's about like relating these things to something that you can recall without imitating anything. You don't want to imitate, you don't want to choreograph something in the future or from the past. It has to be operable right now. So
Well, I'm
that's
wondering some certain things too, like just talking about that sing, the not so much singing as you speak, because I've been toying with that a lot, and I'm realizing that there's some people, like you say, that just kind of come in and they have a very subdued, very just low key kind of personality.
mhm.
Um, and it is difficult to say, well, when you're like, I'm the complete animated self all the time, all day long. So for me and people like me, it is easier for me to say, I need your personality to come into your music, which was my biggest hurdle as an artist. Because coming from again, a classical of this is what pedagogy, this is what formal training means. It means to do A, B, C. It's very specific. So I lost a lot of myself in that. And so I think I find myself being like, no, I need you to speak this first. I need you to speak this in rhythm. I need you to speak this like you mean it. Because in gospel, per se, where we're being a very personal, matter of fact, convicted, this is what I believe. I
Mhm.
need that passion to come through the way that you say it, the way that you say it. And I feel like the speaking voice, particularly, is going to have some of those distinguishing characteristics that's going to distinguish this person from that person. And
And
if I take them too maybe far away from their personality, even if it's subdued or even if the texture of their speaking voice, and I'm not saying if their speaking voice is like, if they're just kind of one of those kind of people, then I'm going to use that. But
I'm one of those.
but if it's a little extreme, that's okay too, because I'm really in that mode of I want to validate you as a person. I don't want you to ever think that in order for you to be valid as a singer or as a person that has something to say, that you have to sound a certain way just because it's my preference. So I'm going to, and I've run across some singers where I first start off saying, "Do you like the way you sound?
Mm,
Do you like it? Are you okay? Are you happy with your sound?" And sometimes they'll say, "Yeah," and I'll say, "Okay. Well, let me just make sure that you don't hurt yourself, or make sure I just let you know that if you keep your voice in this particular place, there are certain styles of music or there are certain sounds that you're going to have a little bit more difficulty making sound smooth because you sound like this all the time. That it's very, and that's okay. I want you to be okay with that.
Mm.
So I'm more about, I just need you to know now I'm going to say, call it your limitations, but I'm going to say, these are going to be some things that are going to come easier than others. And if you want to have this sound, or if you want to sing into, like, say, if they wanted to be a jazz singer, or they wanted to do some sort of worship song that has such a mellow sound, and they need to make the sound, and they're nowhere near that sound, that you're going to have to work harder to achieve it. So I just don't, I want to, like I said, I just want to make sure I'm validating the person, the voice, as a person, and see if I can coax that into some music, into some
And I
music.
think that does provide some complication in the world of music theater, because at
I
the end
can
of the
imagine.
day, we got to make those casting directors happy.
Right.
It's about
good
at
point.
a certain point, and I mean, I suppose in the world of CCM, in the bigger picture, we have to make recording producers happy. We have to make audiences happy. So we have to give people on some level what they are expecting from us. But particularly in the world of music theater, um, just bringing your unique sound is, of course, incredibly important. But then again, the primary focus is this going to get me the job? Is this going to move me in the direction that I want to go? And there's always that balance to be found. And for me, we never walk past that line of where is the function and where is the healthy, sustainable sound.
Melissa, you look
Yeah, it's so
pre-verbal.
hard.
Well, I think that often the uniqueness of a singer is based on some limitation. It's some kind of messed up thing that they have, and
Right.
certainly in the recording industry, it kind of works like that. And of course, in the recording studio, you can do a bunch of things to fix it. You can tune it, you can compress it, you can EQ it, you can do all kinds of things. But it's the ones that pull it off live that really last the longest. But what's very interesting, and people are really surprised because, I'm known for this, screaming maniac. But my warm up is extremely heady resonant, extremely,
Right.
and people are really surprised. But I just, in other words, if I go yee, that's head, but I'm not doing vibrato with it. But it's the same sensation as yee. And if I go yee, it's like that's a noise. It's not a singing sound, it's a noise. So I think that there's a way to, instead of like ask my clients to sing a certain style in the warm up, it's a function based warm up that just manages to move, to navigate like notes, like musical notes, without speed bumps and without any styling whatsoever. No, just vanilla,
And
right?
I and I definitely I would want NATS teachers to understand the last 15 minutes of our conversation on some level. I know what we're talking about authenticity and style and performance, but from a functional perspective, I want our teachers to understand that we're talking about vibratory modes, right? And this, there's a broad spectrum of that, and resonance strategies and the broad spectrum of that. And it's the combining and pairing of those principles that allows us to then make whatever you all want to call a particular sound at that given moment. And I think that's really important.
And I need to say one thing. I need to say one thing because it's like I've got this bee in my bonnet about this. Like what's making me upset is this kind of black and whiteness of belt, and classical is vibrato and CCM is belting. What we're getting is an idea that CCM is like glamming onto this second harmonic really early. So we're going yang 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 yang, and that is so not functionally efficient. So to like take a style and move it into a warm up, like yeah 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 yeah, that is like when it should. Well, I don't want to like go on and on about it, but a warm up is a warm up, and it doesn't need to have a stylistic base to it. It needs to be function based and scientifically evidence based to make it work, no matter what the style is. You sing the song, you sing the room, you sing your beautiful functioning voice will just evolve if it's working correctly. But you don't need to like start whining and not I don't want to be too technical here, but you know what I mean? The second harmonic where you actually like, instead of like maintaining like the fundamental, you start like yelling early on to just sort of like push through that second passaggio. And it's just, it doesn't, it makes people, okay. So this is what I'm noticing that's upsetting me. There are people that are asking singers like mezzo sopranos to try to sound like Celine Dion, who's not a mezzo soprano. And so Celine Dion has like this, like, I think she might be a lyric or a color trope because it's a very trumpet like she sings very high and it's very clear and it's just like a fundamental, like I can't describe it, but just a fundamental, like it's not a big formant thing. It's just like clean. And a mezzo to do that has to squeeze. So to expect to teach people to try to sound like Celine when they don't have the instrument to do that is like, that's why it's not good to try to put genre into a warm up. And I think that Broadway directors need to understand that different voices do different things. There's different kinds of sopranos. So you don't want to say, well, can you sing that a little bit thinner? Can you sing it a little tighter? Because that's not what's going on. So anyway, I've said it.
Yeah. Even in the world of belters, we are now talking, as we've been talking for some time, about Fox in the world of belting.
Right.
We have a Laura Osnes belt, which always is going to sound pretty exciting, but very mixy. And then we have a Patti LuPone belt, which is going to feel very thick and would be untenable for many, many women to sing that way. But her makeup, her physicality, it allows her to do that. So yeah, really recognizing the way we have for eons in classical singing, recognizing that your physical type, the way you're put together, certainly your nurture, but also your nature. How does this all play in?
I love that.
And to just kind of piggyback on that, one of the things that we think about when you think about classical pedagogy, one of the things that makes a voice beautiful is the evenness.
Mhm.
It's the fact that the resonance is going to be maintained throughout the line. So when you're in a style that's not a parameter, and actually the varying mouth shape and tongue and jaw position that changes as I speak and as I go up and down, that very thing is part of our sound. So this is one of those things where if you took a classical pedagogy concept and say, I'm going to teach this person to maintain this balanced sound all the way throughout the phrase. For a gospel singer, that wouldn't necessarily be the right approach as the only option. That's a thing, not the thing, or for a gospel or for a R&B singer. However, what I'm realizing is for jazz, when you're looking at people that are doing vocalises, or which are, then I don't mean classical vocalises, but those are instrumental scat solos that have words to them that have been rewritten for words. So like your Lambert Hendricks and Ross, John Hendricks writes a lot of those things. So they're really fast. Or also your scat, any of your Kenny Wheeler stuff, or are going to have things where the voice is more of an instrument, and you do want to teach that line of can I create this evenness in sound while things are happening around the sound. So these are those that broad spectrum of CCM, that broad spectrum with even there are some things that do apply. There are some things that don't, but the teacher has to know when it does and when it doesn't, and be okay with saying, no, but this is different. Well, this is acceptable in this particular.
We're
Yeah, and at
getting.
the end
Oh,
of the day, flow. No, I'm sorry, I interrupted. At the end of the day, flow phonation is sort of, that's inviolate. We've got to, that's got to be in place no matter what else is happening, and we've got to be on press patrol and all of that. But you're absolutely right.
roll.
Yeah, well,
I've never heard that. That's so. Did you say press patrol, Mike?
I did, yes.
I love. You
too.
may want to explain that to some people. Go. Yeah.
Well, just simply, we're always listening for signs of pressed phonation. Are the chords, is the level both supra and subglottally? Is it optimal? Are we making use of our vocal tract reactants? Are we keeping things easy at the level of the chords? No matter what kind of sound we're making. And one of the things Melissa's brilliant at is taking some of these extraordinarily what we conceive to be very epic, violent sounds, and making them really accessible, and finding that flow phonation inside of them. That's amazing to me.
Thank
I
you.
love that. I'm on press patrol going forward. I will credit you always, Mike.
T-shirts, and I gotta say, I may have picked it up somewhere along the way too. So
We all pick it up.
That's okay. We're
I
doing
wanted
it together.
I
Right.
want to tell you a couple things. I'm getting Alfred says, I am so enjoying the conversation. My head is nodding so much it's about to fall off. I thought that was very fun. And Nat's chatters, we're really getting, we just have probably less than 10 minutes left, and I thought we'd just be bombarded with questions, but I think you guys are doing such a wonderful job that you're answering everything. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to type them. I will. There are just a couple on the table. Anita Martin says, such a great chat. This was way back. So she says, that was literally my question. I'm not sure which one. How do you approach sustainability of authenticity in emotional connection through primal sounds or otherwise in singers that you support that are on tour or in a long run? And I think that came in, Trinice, when you were talking about authenticity. Do you want to take that?
Well, see, when you think about a singer that's on tour versus a singer that's training, just like we want to relate this to sports, how, LeBron James is going to prepare off season, during season, during the playoffs is going to be very, very different. So that question has different levels and different degrees, because when you're on tour, that's like the playoffs. You don't get the time to rest. You don't have very much time in between. So there are some basic fundamental things that has to happen for a singer's body or an athlete's body to be prepared for the task they're about to do. Once you're in the playoffs, once you are on tour, then it's more of a strategy based thing, because now you're sitting here saying, okay, I need to monitor my vocal output. I need to figure out when am I going to have the time to rest. I'm going to do vocal warm-ups and cool downs. I'm going to make sure that I have someone that's going to rescue me right after the show is over. I'm going to do that art of guest appearance. I'm going to come and say hello and then back away. That's a whole different strategy. So the question about how do you prepare for the Primal, that happens before you go on tour. You can't really do that on tour effectively. It's maintenance, and as I would imagine, Mike, the training before a show and a training while the show is running is probably a little bit different. And so if I was going to train before, on the other hand, then it is going to be the functional base. Is my instrument prepared? Is my instrument to prepare to sustain this amount of weight? Is my instrument flexible? Am I stretching the way that I need to vocally? Are my registers balanced? Is my speaking voice, if I'm going to go for my particular speaking voice, can I maintain this particular pitch range and still feel comfortable for a certain amount of time? A lot of my voice, I'm sorry, see, we laughed about not doing the hands, but I'm making sure that I'm going to use style conditioning exercises that's going to keep my voice in this particular pitch range in a speaking manner for a certain amount of time so that I don't feel like I'm going to kind of drop into this particular place. But these are very strategic exercise and a very strategic output that should not ever be confused with touring. That's a different bag. And a different or revival, which is the church version of touring. If you're not a recording artist, so that's a different question, and I don't know if that answered
I bet it did.
the question.
Our favorite straw. Before we run out of time, because in our pre-chat, we talked quite a bit about microphone and the impact on microphone. So I think we should address that. I do have a question I've always wondered, Mike, that you would maybe be able to answer. I find it interesting in the Broadway world that we audition unamplified and yet perform amplified. Can you give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a hot mess. Well, the truth of the matter is, I think even now, as I work with singers, yes, one ear is sort of one part of my brain is thinking, how is this going to work on the body mic? What is this going to sound like when compressed? All of this, but on the other hand, I really feel that I'm doing a disservice to my students if I'm not also preparing them to sing acoustically, and I'm sure, Trinice, you feel the same way, because so often your students, I'm sure, are performing unamplified as well in the gospel tradition. Still, when we're looking back there are many theaters now. We have a great series here in New York at City Center called Broadway Unplugged, where people like, Stephanie J. Block and all our big Broadway singers are asked to perform acoustically. And I absolutely love those concerts because I dig hearing that unamplified, untouched voice. Even if I'm straining to hear it a little bit, that's what I want to hear. And maybe that's the voice teacher in me, but I feel like I have to, for my students, prepare them both for the realities of being on a body mic. Just yesterday, I was saying to somebody who's in revival of Once in the Silent, I said to him, why are you so loud? You do realize that everything is getting condensed, and there was so much effort going into the sound, and there's very little reason to do so. That kind of power, which we would appreciate at the Met, is not making it through to the audience. They're not appreciating that, so it becomes excess work, excess effort. That's maybe there's an easier way of doing that. 8 shows a week. But yeah, I think we have to be in music theater. We have to be preparing people for both realities.
Yeah. And one of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead, Melissa.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Trinice. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that as a solo artist, regardless whether you're in jazz or R&B or gospel, um, the reality is that we are amplified singers. We are electronic instruments. You know, in the gospel choir, you're going to spend more time acoustic, if you will. But particularly jazz, like I like to for my jazz students, they you have to be on a microphone because there's so many aspects of your emotion and so of your emotional communication that would not be picked up otherwise. And if you're not accustomed to being able to exploit those subtleties that would not otherwise be transmitted acoustically, those are things that you have to practice. And you'll find that singers that do not train on a microphone, when they get to a microphone, they either A, don't know how to use it, or B, don't know how to use it to their advantage. There's often that misconception that the microphone is just amplification, like it's just amplifying the sound, but there's so many more dimensions to it. You could hear like it's loud enough, but you're not hearing the certain harmonics that you need that's going to make you not work as hard. Like it's so much more to it than again just a amplified amplification of the sound. There's a different approach to how you sing. Your onsets are different. Every aspect, your offsets have character because you have a microphone. Like there's the way the vowel is shaped, and now I'm talking particularly towards the African American folk base, and this can probably go either way. But when the vowel distortion and all of those different nuances that are a part of the everyday conversation, without the microphone, that does not project over electronic instruments that are playing behind you.
So I work mostly in the recording industry, and the mic is only for distancing. You use the mic not to listen to how you sound, but to use the mic in the distance. In other words, when it's a lighter registration and when you want the verse to sound sexy or intimate, you come into the mic, and then when you're hitting the chorus, you back up not very far, because if you're using like the kind of mic in a club, it doesn't pick up anything past 5 inches because it'll be picking up the drums and everything else. So, but in the recording studio, it's a different thing. You don't move around. If you have in-ears, which most of my recording, like more successful recording artists, they don't have to do mic distancing anymore. They have monitors in here in their ears. So they can do the distancing a bit, but they do need that proprioceptive familiarity with acoustic experience. It doesn't change that much in front of a mic. It's just the distancing that is the issue. Your technique, it sounds different with the EQ on it, but that's none of your business. Because if you're in the authenticity of the moment, you're not listening to how good you sound. You're in it, So it's like, I feel that, Trinice, you're right. We need to have a mic in the studio to train with to a degree, but not to warm up with.
No, definitely. So
Yeah.
that's, any functional or functional training or warming up or conditioning an instrument for the instrument sound is acoustic because it's just about the natural voice. But when it's time to condition the style and doing these, you'll find that people that train acoustically and they try to go for that more intimate sound, they overproduce it because they have so much. And I'm like, well, when you're on a microphone, it's literally not that much effort to do a very, very, very light sound as you would if you were acoustic. So that's very style specific nuances that wouldn't necessarily transfer acoustically as effectively as if one realized that, oh, okay, I'm working way too hard for this itty bitty sound that I need at this particular moment. But to condition your voice to actually be at a very light place and in a speaky place without going into a whisper, that's some conditioning that has to take place. Things that we don't, again, take for granted. Like, when do you ever go into a voice studio to learn how to speak this quiet? I'm going to carry this sound. Like that's not something that one would normally think about doing. So
no, in rock music, we can't get away with that ever because that won't cut through even on a mic.
Right.
We have to
And
use like classical technique to bring in the resonance strategy and add the air to a balanced registration, because with bass and drums, no matter what, that's not cutting through. So you have to have like a head resonant kind of like proprioception in order to like add the air to it, not actually go quiet like this and be,
right.
because authentically that just wouldn't cut it. You know, it would
This
be
is where we talk about this long spectrum of CCM,
yeah,
because R&B, the kind of folk acoustic, that's all in that particular, the Janet Jackson, you get the very, very,
yeah,
very, very light, sexy. It's very light, but that's a completely different context.
I
exactly.
love that you brought that back to broad spectrum, because can you believe our hour has gone so fast? And
Wow.
during the chat, I've never received so many comments about what a fabulous chat, what a perfect panel of voice professionals. Thank you, thank you. So we may have
Oh, we
a
love
part.
y'all too.
And of course, this will be watched on archives as well. So we may have to do this again, but I think it's a really important conversation for we voice professionals to be having about the broad spectrum and listening to people from different perspectives about how you get your singers to make these sounds. So I can't thank the three of you enough for joining me tonight. Let me, as we wrap up what a great season we've had this year again. And the technology aspect has been so smooth because of my partner in crime, Paul Witkowski, and who you all never see, but he is just invaluable to NATS in whole and me personally. Alan Henderson always is in the background and has been so supportive. And of course, this wouldn't be possible to do GoToWebinar without the support of Scott McCoy and Inside View Press. So I can't thank them enough, and all the people who join us every week and keep this ball rolling. I sure enjoy being the host and the moderator, and so I just thank everybody for another great season. And I'm getting ready to think of next year's. I've already got lots of great ideas, but if anyone has ideas, you can email me or Facebook or wherever, and I'll do my best to include those ideas. So thank you, everyone, for a great evening.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. And my guests, you'll stay on with me for a minute and we'll say goodbye to everyone else. If you'll just end your webinars, and hopefully, the most important thing, I'm so sorry, NATS conference in Vegas. Forgive me, Ellen, for forgetting that. June 22nd to 26th. And I'll be there, and I'm sure some of my guests will be there as well. So I hope to see many of you at the NATS Chat conference in Vegas in just a few weeks. So now, good night, everyone. Have a great summer. See you in the fall.
Bye.